So we can continue along with what happened before the crash. Um, we were talking about um, the
Yeah, mental
visual
thoughts
part
and
of the mind,
mental images. Yeah.
right? Being able to construct and be able to visualize and control images. This is actually a skill that some um, people in their professions learn. An example
Okay.
of
You
that
know, in
would
the
be an
military or.
architect who can remember drawings.
Oh, okay. Hmm.
Some people do it naturally and they call it a photographic memory because they can see things and remember the details of it. Um, and so we can also think of this as now an internal kind of right view in the sense of being able to reconstruct or recognize things um, that are visual in the mind. And doing that is kind of a more intentional thing to do when
Hmm.
when we remember to do it and put it as part of the practice, as opposed to letting the thinking or the auditory part of the mind do so much of the work, so that we begin to allow our knowledge of our visualizations, because most people think and think and think and think by talking to themselves without even recognizing that they're constructing mental images. Um,
Oh, yeah. Hmm.
an example of that is years ago, the old man may lived in a certain house, and all that happened was a visualization that popped into his head and then popped right back out again very quickly of one of the rooms that he used to stay in. And now the verbal dialogue will start up to tell a
Hmm.
story about it. And eventually that story then will lead into something bad happened in the room. That's why it always leads to dukkha, is we always tend to dredge up the worst things that are happening, because humans are, by our nature, instinctually, we're problem solving machines. Now, what we're actually doing in a way is changing our nature from being a problem solving machine to doing a data gathering process, becoming a data gathering machine, or beginning to understand, to look at what's going on. And that's a natural new view of the world, because we recognize through our noble right view that there really are no problems. That all of these old problems that I keep coming up with is because of a deep underlying view that my job is, or my rational rationale for existence is, to solve problems. And that basically we're changing our right view then into the way of, no, our job now is not to solve problems. Our job is to see things clearly, to investigate and to keep looking and to keep doing that. And so as you're progressing, one of the things you begin to notice is that the thoughts that you have are junk thoughts. They're certainly irrelevant to how you feel or what you're doing right now. And yet we drag ourselves down with these thoughts, looking for a problem and trying to figure out a solution to that problem. An example of that would be having an argument several years ago with a guy that's probably in the same profession or that you would normally associate with. But now that you've had a problem with him, you want to straighten that problem out, knowing that not happening. There's no way that that guy is going to entertain a forgiveness fest. You still keep thinking about it. We keep thinking about it over and over and over again, trying to solve a problem that really is no problem anymore. The problem was in the heat of that moment. So there's no reason to heat up this moment. And that's a really important point, is to recognize that, in fact, these junk thoughts have heat to them. And so there's no reason to have them, but we can also begin to recognize, where did this thought come from? Was there actually a visual image that popped up that gave rise to this story now that we're telling ourselves about what happened in the past? And so we begin to look. And we do it throughout the day, almost as if the Sati comes at the right opportune moment so that you can see something. That there's something, let us not call it magic, but there's something going on in our favor if we will take advantage of it. In other words, as we begin to practice Sati, that Sati then will begin to arise at points in time that it didn't arise before, and it arises at just the right opportune moment to be able to see something new. Begin to see these visualizations, to begin to see how these visualizations then kick off this running dialogue that we have in the mind that we're calling thoughts, and how these things are related, or how sensations on the body. It's even possible to do this with postures. And and here's what I mean by that is that it's well known in science, but most people don't know or think about it. But it's also well known in those who pay attention to the body, that every human being, without looking, knows the posture of the body. And this is more than merely sense perception of the touch of the skin. That this proprioceptic system goes really, really deep. And so one of the examples that I do, maybe I've done it with you before, is to close your eyes, hold your hand, move it around, right? We've done this. Okay, so that's the proprioceptic system. And that it has to do then when you're sitting in meditation, that you know whether you're drooping or whether you're erect. How do you know that? Is because you can experience that sitting. So they talk about it rising, falling, touching, sitting. So the touching is the proprioceptic, is the tactile. And then the proprioceptic is the sitting part of the Mahasi system. So we're beginning to pay more and more attention. The rising and falling of the breath, the touching of all of the body, and the sitting there is that which we then take care of with the body. But we now have more senses than that. And so we automatically start working with the one that seems to be running away, in charge all the time, is the thinking part. That we talk to ourselves a lot in the form of thought. But there's another way of thinking. In fact, there are 6 ways of thinking, based upon at least 5, based upon the primary associations of our contact with reality. We have the proprioceptic, we have the tactile, we have visual. Now, the eye itself can only see colors, shapes, and movement. And it sees it with rods and cones so that we see it within 3 colors. Putting together shades of color and putting in the shapes and whatnot is part of the optical brain. And the optical nerve, much of the processing of the signal from the eye is done before it actually gets into this upper cortex of this part of the brain, which is where the visualizations are processed. So Once we get to the point then of beginning to make sense out of what we see, the more that we're able to make sense out of it, the more perception needs to be done. And that perception is a processing that takes old memories and old visualizations and puts them into context so that we can
Mm-hmm.
recognize that object in front of me as a tree or a car. All of these kind of things is actually much of the processing. But the imprint of the visualization then is merely stored as an object that when it's brought up again, we still need to put a concept with it in the sense of
Mm-hmm.
that object
Okay.
as a car. And so we conceptualize things basically by talking about it. That's how humans understand. And they do it that way because they have not fully developed their or use enough to give it good exercise, their touch, their tactile, their proprioceptic, their eyes. Okay,
Okay.
even for meditation, that is a very good practice. So that at every retreat center that I've ever been around, especially at Watch the One Moke, they do mealtime as a food meditation,
Mm-hmm.
so that you really begin to open up that tactile sense of the food in the mouth. That really, really we begin to pay close attention to what's going on. And that wakes up the taste buds. It wakes up that olfactory system that we don't pay much attention to and don't work with. And because of that, we're undeveloped. A really interesting example of that is wine connoisseurs, right? But they
Okay.
don't. That one of the important qualities of becoming a wine connoisseur is to sniff the bouquet
Mm-hmm.
of the fruit of the vine. So uh, they develop that. They pay attention to it. They notice what they smell. They put it in context to things that they've smelled in the past, and then they bring this system of perception so that their salayatana that has odors in it is completely different than the salayatana of the ordinary person. Another example of that would be a florist who spends a lot of time, especially if she's training herself, to know a flower not by its sight and its petals and shapes,
Mm-hmm.
but by what it smells like. What is the fragrance of this flower? Because roses are completely different than daffodils,
Mm-hmm.
have a completely different odor. So, beginning to open up our senses is basically what we're working with through meditation, but we're opening the senses in both ways, internally and externally.
Okay.
And yet, the thinking part of the mind is what we spend so much time doing because we know how to think. And so
Mm-hmm.
that's how we spend our time. Um, an example of that with the visualizations would be someone who spends an awful lot of time doing a game, something like Sudoku, will
Okay.
then in their dreams begin to play Sudoku games.
Mm-hmm.
They maybe even remember the last Sudoku game that they played
Mm-hmm.
in reality and begin to replay it in their mind,
Mm-hmm.
not recognizing that they actually did remember every piece on that board well enough so that they could reconstruct it visually and then play the game while they're asleep and dreaming. And if they're lucky, they even know that they're asleep and dreaming about Sudoku. So this is where the mind with the visualizations can come into play. So now that you're beginning to wake up to the auditory and
Mm-hmm.
catching it often, even catching it while you're half asleep, when you're up in the middle of the night, you can say, "There it goes." Also, now you're beginning to are starting to take the time to add these extra senses in
Okay.
to the job. Begin to note what it is that's in the mind in the form of visualization. There is another way of looking at first jhana, other than the way that we typically use, in the sense
Okay.
of once the mind is free from hindrances, and that we are pleased that the mind is free from hindrances, and we feel relief and relaxed, and we know that we can do this. Then the next, and we're taking deep breaths, etc., so that we've got the mind fit for work. Now we're looking at it as applied and sustained thought. That we apply the mind to what we want to apply it to in the sense of wholesome.
Mm-hmm.
And then we sustain the mind in the sense that we're going to keep this. And so at that point, the normal instruction is for the student to go on guard for the thoughts, to not let any thoughts come in that are harmful, to let only wholesome thoughts come in, and any kind of junk thoughts or harmful thoughts or thoughts about the past will actually take us out of this state of deep satisfaction. Okay? So we're going to try to maintain that. And so this is how we look at it, as applied and sustained thought. But now here's another way of looking at it. This applied and sustained thought, the Pali words, is vicha and vaka. Now, vicha and vaka, knowing that this is an Indo-European language, we can go right to the Latin or the Greek and see if we can figure out from that perspective what this word is. And what we come up with is voice or vox for and V or vika is to see. So now we have seeing and hearing as applied and sustained thought. This is another way of looking at it, in the sense that when there is applied thought or the vika, that means that we now can see these mental images.
Okay.
And the vaka means that now we are paying attention to and we recognize this voice that's there. All right. But we're taking it a little bit further by kind of emphasizing the voice in the sense of using applied and sustained thought to sustain the voice or to sustain the thoughts in a wholesome way, rather than allowing them to deteriorate into an unwholesome way. So now we're going to add an extra element to it, and that is to begin while you're in a state of first jhana, in that state of happy contentment, that we also begin to watch the visual thoughts that float by. That in fact you could think of it in the sense of the sky, that vocal thoughts are like clouds that sometimes are kind of still and fluffy and beautiful and all of that, and sometimes they're moving. And then begin to also think about that, well, if that's true, then the visual thoughts is like a jet plane, except that it goes even faster. It's like, all right, so this is a way to begin to understand that there's things happening in the mind that the skilled meditator now can begin to look at. These visualizations, to begin to recognize that sometimes these visualizations, like the example of the old man, he just has a flash of a thought about a room that he used to live in 30 years ago, and now there is his mind going, I hate that old woman. Whatever those thoughts are going to be. So this is something new to begin to add to your practice. And always it's the building up of the Sati. And so we want to continue to practice doing Sati. And the way that you can do that, just like in the past, we have used sitting down. Every time that you sit down, that you're going to become mindful. All right. Be sure that you're practicing that.
Okay. I kind
Okay?
of fell off of that. I'll
Remember to
resume it.
remember. And so you begin to sit down, and every time that you do, whenever you sit down, any mental images that flash by in the mind, take note of that.
Okay. Hmm.
And whenever you stand up, then remember that the technique is to remember what the intention was. That intention will also almost always come with a visual flash.
Probably the flash will be first, and then maybe.
Then we'll think about it. Okay. So
Okay.
which came first, that image flash or the discussion about it that happened a second later?
Okay.
And so we also want to then, after we become dedicated to this practice, that this is actually a really important part of the progress of a student, that once we understand this technique, we begin to apply it as often as we can think about it.
Okay.
And that in the sutras, the Buddha talks about it in this way,
The
that
seeing is only the seeing in a. Okay.
even though the young monk is doing his duties at the temple, he might be sweeping or whatever, still he's thinking about Dhamma. He's
Mhm.
trying to keep his sati high. And the example is the mother cow who has a newborn calf that even though she's eating grass, even though you're doing your duties at work, still your intention is to be sharp, to look at what you're doing. And so we start off with this idea of doing it every time you sit down or stand up. But now I give you the
Okay.
opportunity to invent new things.
Mhm.
An example would be every time you pick something up. Every time you pick something up.
Oh, I forgot. No.
And that takes even more skill. Okay. The Buddha talks about it in the sense of actually beginning to slow things down so that we can actually see the reaching.
Ah, okay.
Okay. The reaching and the grasping of an object
I
is
remember
an
now.
opportunity for sati.
Okay. I think I saw some. I think there were instructions for a Mahasi retreat or from a Mahasi book, and they said while on retreat you should act like a cripple. You should do everything pretty slowly, get up slowly, pick up something.
That's also, in order to do that, you see, at normal speed, we automatically do it.
Mhm.
And so we're not paying any attention to it. But I haven't used that before, but yeah, beginning to act like a cripple in the sense of now we're beginning to see that we are kind of unsteady. And so we're going to slow down and pay close attention to what's going on, to pay wise attention. All right. So this story that I told you about the mother cow and her calf, the next part is that not only we begin to get dedicated to the Dhamma, uh, and wanting to look often, to check on that calf. Okay, is that calf okay? Is it okay now? How about now? Okay, so this is the way we begin to practice, but then a new quality enters the picture, and this goes in from step, or let us call it the fifth knowledge. The fifth of the seven knowledges for the Sotapan. That fifth knowledge is that we begin to pay close attention, that we become dedicated
Okay.
to looking at the Dhamma. We become dedicated to watching what the mind and the body is doing. We become dedicated to seeing these visual images. All right. And so now the sixth knowledge is when we bring in a quality of eagerness or enthusiasm. And this eagerness and enthusiasm naturally has to be based on confidence that we can do this. An example of that would be the relationship between Sherlock Holmes and
What?
Watson, because Watson was always, even though he was around Sherlock Holmes, he was always full of doubt. He was curious and he was enamored by Sherlock Holmes, but Sherlock Holmes was not full of doubt. He was full of curiosity. He wanted to know, and he also knew that he could figure it out because he'd figured out so much stuff before. So in that way, we want to become a Sherlock Holmes of our own mind, that we become completely curious, completely dedicated to it, and completely enthusiastic about it. So now our Sati is coming up quite often. Every time we reach out and grasp something, every time we sit down, every time we stand up, every time we start to move, these are all opportunities for us to come back to the present moment and to say, what am I thinking about right now? Oh, I saw that go by. I said, that was a... And you'll begin to understand how quick the mind is. Wow, the mind is so fast. This stuff happens so quickly. And so we have to practice being there for it to watch what's happening, because it's really fast. I would say maybe a tenth of a second is probably longer than some of these visual images would take. They're just real flashes. And if we're alert to it, we can get the detail in the outline. But if we're not alert to it, still that image has the power to start up the thought process. And the thought process is triggered just to really get started anyway. So it'll use any excuse. Any excuse at all will do, but it generally does start with some excuse, some visual image, a touch, a body posture, that we can get into certain body postures and remember things that we couldn't, because the body posture itself, the proprioceptive system, was part of the memory. And so an example of that would be the fetus position, that we curl up like this. And then we can see things differently than if we lay, for instance, in bed all spread out. These body postures have a quality. So you can also begin to play with that. What posture you're in, how does that affect what you're thinking and what visualizations you have and whatnot like that? That when we begin to get good at it, we can recognize that that whenever we do have these visualizations or these flashes of old memories or whatever, there is a quality of proprioceptic that is in there. In other words, who is the you, or where is the body, or where is in this case, the camera? And what is the camera's posture, and what is the camera doing when it takes this visual image that's now being reconstructed or memory? Okay, so how our posture then affects our visualizations in very subtle ways that we normally don't recognize until we start looking for it. And so, well, have I given you a whole bunch of assignment today?
There's a lot to play with.
Right, lots to play with, and that's the whole point about then enthusiasm, is that, yeah, I've got a whole bunch of stuff that I can play with now. This stuff is really good. And that it by practicing this way, it really will begin to elevate these layers of Sati, so that you can become more alert and more awake more often throughout the day.
Awesome.
Excellent. Well, go play with it. Go play with your proprioceptive. Go play with your visualizations. Go play with how these visualizations affect the thought. But do it because you're paying a lot of attention to it, or that you're noticing, or that your Sati is improving. That this is the main goal, is to get that Sati going, to wake you up, so now you can remember to do all of these things that we've been talking about. So touching, grasping, reaching, letting go, moving the arms, with the position of the arms, these are all ways of beginning to work with this proprioceptic system, so that you begin to get in touch with the fact that you know where your hands are, you know what the leg is doing, if you pay attention to it, because the information about all of that is part of your body system. It's part of the I guess proprioceptic would be the right word for it. And it here's a way of looking at it. Everything in your body is connected through the spinal cord right up into the reptilian brain.
Oh, yeah.
The reptilian brain has the body. The body is owned by the reptilian brain, and that the best that the frontal cortex can do is offer suggestions. And so with that, we're beginning to pay more attention to what the body is doing. We pay more attention to what the eyes see and what is seen by the eyes and then remembered later. These flashes of visualizations. You begin to see more and more about how the mind is constructed, how it, well, not constructed so much, that takes an autopsy, how it functions. It's actually quite amazing that neuroscience is beginning to catch up with the Buddha, because the Buddha already know about all of these functions. Now the neuroscience is identifying the components that are associated with these functions. They're going to figure it out. They're going to eventually have an enlightenment pill, I'm sure of it. There'll come a time when the Buddha is unnecessary. We all just take a happy pill and... No, I think there's always going to be the use of the value in training. You can't take a pill. I don't know how one would take a pill. You might be able to feel good because the pill puts dopamine in the mind or something like that. But to actually be able to understand the functioning of one's own mind takes some research, some looking.
Yeah, it needs some attention, introspection. Otherwise...
Putting it all together, connecting the dots, exactly.
Yeah, I think the problem is fundamental and recursive. To pay attention, you need to pay attention. You need attention to develop more attention.
Right. So that's why we put all of these triggers or all of these little things in about sitting down, standing up, grasping a hold of something, touching, reaching. All of these are things that we do physically that can then be anchors or triggers for mindfulness. That's the whole point, is to use the slowing down of the hand to build mindfulness. Then in a way, you would have to see that it takes mindfulness for the breathing that we're doing. To breathe in takes mindfulness. We have to remember to take in a deeper breath, and we have to remember to let it out in a sigh and relax. And so in that regard, every in-breath takes Sati and every out-breath takes Sati. And so that's another way of recognizing it, that Sati is an enormous skill that needs to be developed. And it all is wrapped around, they call it mindfulness, but a more important way of looking at it is to remember, to look at what's going on, to wake up, to see what's happening.
I think there was an analogy, I think it's in the sutras, of a chariot with 5 horses and Sati being the middle one, and that the horses on the side need to be balanced, but Sati can go as fast as it wants since in the center. I really like that.
I think I've heard that sutra someplace. I'm not sure which one it is, but yes, Sati is the lead horse. If Sati is not happening, the other guys are really lazy. I think that's true in actual horse teams, that one horse is going to be designated as the lead, and he's going to be out front. He might have a partner, but even that partner knows that, no, it's the other horse. He's the lead. He's the one that runs the show. Same way with huskies and sleds, the same thing. Okay. So with the mind, it's Sati. That's the lead horse. If he's working, all of them are working. If he ain't working, nobody's working. So that's the thing, is to begin to develop these tools or techniques to wake up more and more often. Because the more often that you wake up, the more likely you are to have a chance of seeing these visualizations, to see how proprioceptic influences the visualizations, to see how fast they are. And then the mind gets started up sort of like a movie that's trying to document what happened in a flash of an instant.
I just noticed a few moments ago I had a flash of me lifting the cup to my lips. I like the cup in front of my face with my hands.
Mm-hmm.
But it was, I think there was also the proprioceptive, so I felt like the intention to move in my arms and the feeling in my throat. That I think the feeling in my throat was first, and that triggered the image flash and the feeling in my arms. So
Oh, that's good. Keep looking at that. Keep seeing how these things are connected somehow. Look at the cause and effect
okay.
and much of that, because you're already now at the point to where you're beginning to really pay attention to the thoughts and recognize what they are. Now you can begin to add this extra stuff to pay attention to,
Okay.
so that you begin to pay attention to all of the senses.
All right.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, we'll see you later.
Yeah, this
I'm
has
sure
been a
we can
great talk.
find something else to talk about next time too.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Okay, bye-bye.
拜拜 Have a nice day. Have fun with it.